What if the most rational decision you could make was to believe in something before the evidence was complete? William James, one of the most influential minds in philosophy and psychology, argued that faith is not a betrayal of reason, it is its fulfillment. Under conditions of uncertainty. In an age where skepticism is often equated with intelligence, faith has been dismissed as irrational, emotional, even dangerous. But James invites us into a different story. In his seminal essay, The Will to Believe, he asks, what do we do when we face live options decisions that matter deeply, that must be made now, but where evidence alone cannot compel us? This is not about superstition, it's about moral courage. James insists that the decision to believe in certain moments is not only permissible, it is necessary. Because waiting for absolute proof often means refusing to act at all. And in life, in love, in ethics, in the pursuit of meaning, the refusal to act is already a choice. This video will take you deep into the philosophical terrain where faith and reason meet not in opposition, but in creative tension. You'll discover that faith, for James, is not a passive state of mind. It is an active wager, a commitment to possibilities that cannot be verified in advance, but that may become true through the very act of belief. If you've ever hesitated, at the edge of a decision, waiting for certainty that never comes, this is the exploration you need. William James doesn't ask you to reject reason. He asks you to use it more fully, to face the risk that belief always demands. A man stands at a crossroads, not metaphorically, but literally. Two paths stretch before him. One leads into a fog, mysterious and uncertain. The other is clear, well-trodden, safe. He hesitates. Logic suggests waiting, but the path won't wait. Time presses forward. William James would call this a genuine option, live, forced, momentous. And in that moment, what the man believes will determine how he moves. James was never interested in philosophy as abstraction. He wanted a philosophy that helped people live. And few questions are more pressing than this. When evidence is inconclusive, is belief irrational? Or is it sometimes the most rational thing you can do? In The Will to Believe, James dismantled the notion that rationality means perpetual withholding of commitment. He challenged the intellectualism of his time, especially thinkers like W.K. Clifford, who argued that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. For James, this was not just overly cautious. It was inhuman. He asked, what happens in real life? In friendship, in love, in moral growth? Do we always wait for certainty before we commit? No. We act, we trust, we leap because life demands it. Waiting for perfect clarity often means missing the opportunity entirely. And that is its own form of irrationality. James was clear. Not all beliefs are equal. Faith is justified only when three criteria are met. First, the option must be live. It must feel like a real possibility to the individual. Second, it must be forced in action, must also count as a decision. And third, it must be momentous. It must matter deeply and irreversibly. Under these conditions, he argued, belief is not only allowed, it is ethically necessary. This is where James's genius shines. He does not reduce belief to wishful thinking. He raises it to an existential responsibility. In a world where not all truths can be known in advance, the human being must sometimes decide without proof. And that decision, when sincere and contextually justified, is rational. Take love, for example. No one can prove in advance that they will be loved in return. Yet if one waits for evidence before committing emotionally, the relationship may never begin. The belief helps create the fact. James called this the faith ladder, the way in which belief, under certain conditions, brings about the very reality it anticipates. In this sense, faith is performative. It shapes the world, not merely reflects it. The act of believing becomes part of the causal chain that brings new truths into being. And this is not magical thinking. It is pragmatic realism. James does not say belief guarantees success. He says that in some cases, it is the only way to test what is possible. And yet, this act of faith is not blind. It is not imposed from above. It arises from the personal, the particular, the lived. James was allergic to dogma. He did not want to replace skepticism with credulity. He wanted to make room for moral agency in the face of uncertainty. To believe for James is to take a risk, but a risk that reason can justify. When the heart is involved, this is why he connected faith to courage. The decision to believe, when made responsibly, is not weakness. It is strength. It is the courage to say, I do not know for sure, but I will act as if it might be true, because not acting would mean closing the door to a meaningful future. This courageous faith is what James admired in religious experience, but also in science and democracy, in human relationships. He saw it as the engine of all forward motion. Without it, we become paralyzed by the demand for impossible certainty. With it, we become co-creators of reality. So when you find yourself at your own crossroads, when reason runs out, but the moment demands a decision, remember this. Belief is not the opposite of reason. Sometimes it is reason's final act. And if this way of thinking opens something in you, consider subscribing. Not out of routine, but because faith, real, tested, courageous faith, deserves a place in our conversations. And your attention is the first step in that commitment. The room is dimly lit. A woman paces. In her hand is a letter unopened, trembling. She doesn't know what it contains. An invitation? A rejection? She fears the answer, but more than that, she fears not acting. And so, she opens it. That motion, simple and charged, is not a response to certainty. It is a leap. William James would call it the will to believe. James never sought to define faith as blind obedience. To the contrary, he placed it within the realm of lived, embodied reason. He saw that belief, under certain conditions, functions as a wager, not a gamble on fantasy, but a decision made in the fog of experience. And that decision, when made in earnest, becomes a mechanism through which truth may become real. He challenged the Cartesian ideal of the suspended mind, the thinker who withholds judgment until all evidence is clear. That image, James argued, is a myth. Life doesn't wait for certainty. It pushes us into the arena before the script is written. And there, in the arena, the refusal to believe can be just as consequential as belief itself. He used the example of friendship. Suppose someone shows signs of kindness. If you approach with trust, you open the space for friendship to grow. If you approach with suspicion, you may poison the possibility. The belief itself shapes the unfolding reality. James argued that this is not irrational, it is the human condition. Belief is sometimes the precondition for truth, not its reward. But how do we avoid mere wishful thinking? James placed strict limits. Faith must respond to genuine options, live, forced, momentous. It must arise in contexts where action is required, where delay means decision, where the stakes are real. It must be rooted in a sincere readiness to test and be tested. Faith, for James, is never static. It is a living experiment. In this light, rationality expands. It is no longer confined to cold calculation. It becomes a dynamic engagement with life's ambiguity. Reason, in James's hands, is not a referee, it is a guide into uncertainty. It helps us discern when to wait and when to leap. And sometimes, it tells us, you must leap. That leap is never abstract. It is embodied, personal, charged with consequences. James saw this clearly in religious life. He never asked whether God exists in the absolute sense. He asked what difference it makes to live as if God exists. What changes in the moral life? The sense of meaning, the commitment to others? These are not secondary questions. They are, for James, the only questions that matter. He wrote, "A belief is true if it works in the way of belief, if it performs satisfactorily the function of a belief. That performance is always under review, always provisional. Truth, then, is not static, it is evolving, emerging in the very act of belief and its consequences." This is what James called pragmatism, the view that ideas must be judged by their fruits. And faith, understood pragmatically, is not an escape from reason. It is a disciplined risk. It says, I see enough to try. I trust enough to move. And in moving, I open the door to verification. If the belief leads to coherence, growth, vitality, it earns its place. James's understanding of faith reclaims it from superstition and fanaticism. He places it back in the human story as a tool of survival, of creation, of depth. He recognizes that we are finite beings, navigating infinite uncertainties. In that navigation, faith becomes not a crutch, but a compass. And yet, this compass requires courage. Faith is never imposed. It cannot be borrowed. It must be lived, tested, refined. It must be held lightly, yet earnestly. It must welcome doubt, not fear it. For James, doubt and faith are partners, not enemies. Doubt sharpens faith. Faith gives doubt its purpose. So imagine again the woman with the letter. Her hands still shake, but she opens it. She steps into the unknown. And in that step, she becomes someone new, not because she found certainty, but because she acted where certainty was not yet possible. This is faith as a rational act. And it is waiting for you in every unanswered question, every unopened door. Asterisk. The boy stands at the edge of a diving board. The pool glistens below. He has never jumped before. Logic runs through him like a checklist. The height, the water depth, the angle. But something else is louder possibility. He can't know how it will feel. He must jump to find out. And when he does, arms flailing into the blue, he embodies a principle far older than psychology. Belief precedes proof. For William James, this is not childish impulse, it is human essence. The refusal to leap, to act, until all conditions are perfect is not rationality, is paralysis. And this paralysis, left unchecked, becomes a form of self-erasure. Life becomes a rehearsal for a moment that never comes. In the will to believe, James does something radical. He defends belief not in spite of uncertainty, but because of it. He asks us to consider the places where passivity becomes its own kind of dogma, where refusing to believe cuts us off from realities that could have emerged through commitment. He does not speak as a theologian. He speaks as a psychologist, a philosopher, and most of all, as a student of lived experience. He looks to the concrete, relationships, vocations, moral causes. These are arenas where proof often comes after belief, not before. Where to act as if is the only way to discover what might be true. James calls this faith in the possibility, and it is not naive optimism. It is a gamble, but a reasoned one, a lived one. It says, I see enough to move forward, even though I do not see everything. I will give myself to this hypothesis, not blindly, but fully. This kind of belief is generative. It does not manipulate reality, but invites it. It asks, what becomes possible if I trust? And then, it listens to the answer that action provides. This is not wish fulfillment. It is pragmatic verification, the idea that truth is made real through its consequences. But here James is careful. Not all beliefs are safe to test. The context matters. The ethics matter. He is clear. Faith must be live, forced, momentous. It must deal with real possibilities, real choices, real consequences. Anything less is fantasy. This is why his pragmatism is so powerful. It does not ask, is this belief comfortable? It asks, what happens when this belief is lived? And from there, it builds a model of truth that is deeply personal, but never solipsistic. Because consequences are not internal alone, they unfold in the world. To believe, then, is to begin something. It is a seed, not a verdict. And like a seed, it must be planted, nurtured, risked. James insisted that the moral universe itself is shaped by the acts of belief we are willing to perform. Faith, in this sense, is a force of moral creativity, is where his vision departs entirely from dogma. He makes room for difference, for pluralism, for personal paths. What matters is not that everyone believes the same, but that everyone takes responsibility for what they believe, and for how those beliefs shape experience. Faith becomes then not just a right, but a duty. The duty to give reality a chance, to let the unknown speak, to stop asking for guarantees and start testing for meaning. And here lies a subtle but transformative truth. Belief is not a refuge from risk. It is a form of risk that deepens life. The great error, James warns, is to equate skepticism with safety. Often, it is the believer who is braver because they move where others freeze. If anything in this has struck a chord, if you felt yourself hovering on the edge of your own leap, know this: William James would not ask you to be sure. He would ask you to be honest. Is the belief live? Is it forced? Is it momentous? If the answer is yes, you are already at the threshold. What remains is the courage to cross. He listens to the ticking of a clock in a hospital room. His friend lies unconscious beside him. The doctors have given no guarantees. He has read the charts, the prognosis, the cold probabilities, and yet he stays. Not just out of duty, but because he believes in something no statistic can measure, the possibility of return. William James would not call this irrational. He would call it human. James knew that our most meaningful decisions are rarely made in the light of certainty. They are forged in twilight, when the outlines blur, when the path is shrouded. And in those moments, what we choose to believe doesn't just reflect who we are, it creates who we might become. He understood the tension between belief and doubt not as a battle to be won, but as a relationship to be lived. Faith, he argued, is not the opposite of reason. It is reason's extension into areas where logic alone cannot carry us. Where evidence runs out, but life continues. In The Will to Believe, he described the human condition as one of permanent risk. We are never granted full knowledge in advance. We must act under uncertainty. And because of this, belief is not an aberration. It is a necessity. It allows us to move forward where paralysis would otherwise reign. But James's most profound insight is that belief is ethical, not because it is moralistic, but because it commits the self to consequences. When we believe something about a person, a cause, a future, we do more than entertain an idea. We align our behavior with it. We begin to live in its direction. This is why belief cannot be trivial. James was ruthless with beliefs that insulated people from experience, that made them lazy, cruel, or complacent. He asked, "What is the moral fruit of your faith? Does it open you to the world or close you off? Does it deepen your courage or merely dull your fear?" He wrote, "Believe that life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact." This is not optimism. It is metaphysical activism. It suggests that reality is, in part, responsive to our belief in it, that the world we inhabit is co-authored by the meanings we choose to enact. This is not magic. It is pragmatism. The effects of belief are observable. They change behavior. They alter the course of lives. And because of that, belief must be chosen carefully, but not fearfully. Fearful belief is dogma. Careful belief is courage. James believed in a pluralistic universe, not just in the sense of multiple cultures or truths, but in the sense that reality itself is open-ended, incomplete, subject to the contributions of willful beings. And in that openness, belief becomes a creative act. It writes possibility into being. This is why he resisted the idea of a closed system. He rejected philosophies that offered total explanations. For him, the universe is unfinished, and so are we. And belief, under uncertainty, becomes our way of joining the unfinishedness with dignity. But what does this mean for us now? It means that every time we withhold belief out of fear of being wrong, we must ask, what truth might I be helping to suppress? What door might I be keeping closed, simply because I am afraid to open it without a guarantee? James would not ask you to believe recklessly, but he would ask, what do you lose by refusing to believe? What kind of self do you build by demanding certainty before commitment? And here lies the most haunting implication of his philosophy. The self is not a discovery. It is a construction. And belief is one of its tools. So return to the hospital room. The man who stays, who believes in the return of his friend, does not know what will happen. But his belief shapes his presence, his patience, his persistence. It shapes the moral texture of this moment. And in that texture, a new kind of truth begins to form. Not proven, but lived. Not guaranteed, but generative, not known in advance, but made real in the act of faith. And so we ask, what truth might you be preventing from becoming real simply because you are waiting too long to believe? The door creaks open. A young man steps into a lecture hall, clutching a notebook that's already full of doubts. He's heard the arguments: science, determinism, empiricism. Faith, he believes, is for the weak. And yet, something unsettles him. It is not a counter-argument. It is the quiet conviction in his professor's voice as he reads aloud from William James. Our faith is faith in someone else's faith and in the possibility of a faith that is to come. The sentence strikes him not as doctrine, but as invitation. James's vision of belief is unlike any other. It is not an inheritance of fixed ideas, nor a rejection of inquiry. It is a bold middle path, a living, breathing wager on unseen possibilities, grounded not in abstract logic, but in lived consequence. Faith, for James, is not about certainty. It is about action in the presence of uncertainty. In his lectures and essays, James returned again and again to the idea that the human experience is irreducibly personal, not private, but particular. We do not encounter the world from a distance. We stand in it, risk ourselves in it, and must respond to it with what James called volitional energy. This energy is what allows us to believe, to hope, to commit not despite doubt, but through it. He understood that faith can become tyrannical, delusional, even violent. And he was deeply suspicious of belief systems that refuse revision, that silence disagreement. But he also saw another danger, one equally corrosive: the freezing of the soul and permanent skepticism, the refusal to commit, the spiritual anemia that comes from endless postponement. To believe, for James, is to be vulnerable. It is to open oneself to being wrong, but it is also to open the future. He saw that belief, when sincere and contextually grounded, is not a wall, it is a threshold, and once crossed, it changes not only the believer, but the world the believer inhabits. This is the central insight of Jamesian faith. The world is partially formed by our attitude toward it, not in the mystical sense of bending reality with desire, but in the ethical sense of inviting certain realities to emerge through our participation. A teacher who believes in a student may draw forth their potential. A community that believes in justice may make it real through its labor. These are not miracles. They are consequences. James's radical claim is that belief is a form of agency. It is not a retreat from the world. It is a creative act within it. And like all creativity, it is risky, uncertain, unfinished. But it is real. This idea reverberates through his pragmatism. Truth for James is not a static entity to be found. It is a living process to be enacted. A belief is true insofar as it helps us navigate experience meaningfully, fruitfully, responsibly. The test of a belief is not whether it fits into a pre-existing system, but whether it works ethically, existentially, practically. And faith, when it works, becomes a tool for moral growth. It leads us into deeper engagements, richer responsibilities, more generous perceptions. It expands the radius of the real, but this kind of faith cannot be mass-produced. It must be chosen, cultivated, lived. James respected the individual's right to say no, to disbelieve, but he insisted that disbelief must be as accountable as belief. Both are choices. Both shape consequences. Both carry risk. So to the student in the lecture hall, doubtful, listening, James offers neither command nor certainty, only an honest question. Are you withholding belief because it is false or because it is frightening? And to all of us, he offers the same invitation, to see faith not as an escape, but as a path. Not a guarantee of truth, but a way to co-create it. Not the end of inquiry, but its boldest form. Because sometimes, the most rational act is not to wait, but to begin. The fog lifts slowly over a valley. A woman steps onto a dirt path, backpack on her shoulders, map in hand, but the destination is only roughly drawn. There's no GPS, no final assurance, only her footsteps and the trust that the road itself will become clearer as she moves. William James would recognize this as the existential shape of faith, walking into the unknown, not blindly, but bravely. Faith, for James, is not the enemy of evidence. It is the friend of experience. It is what allows us to navigate ambiguity with integrity. In a universe that withholds guarantees, belief becomes not only permissible, it becomes vital. He used the phrase the faith ladder to describe how belief operates in stages. It begins with a hypothesis, a live possibility that matters. Then comes the volitional act, choosing to believe before the final proof arrives. If that belief proves fruitful in practice, it ascends into something more durable, truth as lived verification. But this is not a private fantasy. James emphasized that belief must pass through the fire of consequences. It must work not just emotionally, but ethically. The faith that gives rise to cruelty, rigidity, or isolation is a failed faith. Real belief, in his vision, expands the self toward openness, action, and relation. That expansion, though, is not without tension. To believe in something means exposing oneself to the possibility of being wrong. It means trusting that the future might cooperate, but also acknowledging that it might not. James never denied the risk. He honored it. For him, the risk was the price of freedom. In this way, faith becomes the hallmark of a morally awake life. Not because it offers escape, but because it demands engagement. It calls us not just to think, but to live our thinking. And nowhere is this more evident than in his reflections on religion, not as doctrine, but as experience. In the Varieties of Religious Experience, James chronicles individuals whose lives were transformed not by argument, but by encounter, by something they interpreted as divine, even when the world did not agree. He did not ask whether those experiences were objectively real. He asked what they produced. Did they lead to greater love? Greater courage? Greater commitment to justice? If so, then they were not delusions. They were morally justified beliefs. This is a radical move. It relocates truth from static systems into dynamic lives. It says that a belief is not validated by abstract correspondence, but by lived performance. In this light, faith becomes a kind of moral improvisation guided not by certainty, but by sincerity and responsiveness. But James was not naive. He knew the dangers of belief, its tendency to harden into fanaticism, to silence doubt, to become coercive. That's why he insisted on the personal character of faith. It must never be imposed. It must arise from within as a free act of the individual will. He gave us tools for discernment. Is the belief live, forced, momentous? Does it lead to generative consequences? Is it open to revision? Is it grounded in practice, not just proclamation? When these conditions are met, faith is not a retreat from the world. It is a courageous step into it. And this courage is not loud. It often looks like a quiet persistence, a mother who continues to hope, a teacher who refuses to give up, a citizen who believes change is still possible. Each of these acts, James would say, is a rational act of faith. Not because it avoids doubt, but because it moves through it. And this movement is what makes the self. Belief is not an ornament. It is a shaping force. We become who we are by the possibilities we are willing to bet on. So picture again the woman on the path. She does not walk because she knows exactly where it ends. She walks because something in her says, this is worth walking toward, and in that step, repeated with care and courage, the landscape begins to change, not only outside, but within. A musician tunes her instrument in a darkened hall. The audience hasn't entered yet. There's no applause, no spotlight. Just her, alone, adjusting the tension of each string not to perform, but to prepare. Faith, in the Jamesian sense, is like that, a hidden labor, a private discipline that makes public life possible. William James never confused faith with spectacle. He rooted it in the invisible structures of character, habit, and volition. In his vision, belief is not simply a thought you think, it is a posture you inhabit, a readiness to engage the unknown with sincerity. This posture does not emerge from nowhere. It must be cultivated, trained, rehearsed, and the way we train. It is through what James called the moral gymnasium of everyday life. Choices made without fanfare, loyalties formed without proof, small commitments repeated until they become part of who we are. Faith, then, is not a singular decision. It is a form of attention, the sustained act of keeping one possibility alive even when it flickers. James believed this attention is a form of creative power. It does not invent reality, but it invites it. It is the precondition for any transformation. In this light, belief becomes a quiet heroism, the courage not to know and yet to proceed, the will to keep believing in justice or love or change even when cynicism would be easier. And this will is not abstract, it is embodied. It must be practiced. James was fascinated by the way beliefs form. He did not think they are chosen once and for all. He saw them as responses to need, to temperament, to experience. Some beliefs are inherited, some are discovered, others are chosen in moments of crisis. But all are tested through time. He wrote, "Our faith today is faith in someone else's faith." That is, we are influenced by those around us, not just in what we believe, but in how we believe. Faith is contagious. It spreads through example, through the dignity of someone who lives by their convictions, Not with arrogance, but with depth. This is why James paid such close attention to religious experience. Not because he wanted to defend institutional religion, but because he saw in those experiences a model of inner transformation. The religious convert, the mystic, the pilgrim, they are not proofs of doctrine. They are case studies in moral energy. And that energy, James insisted, can be found outside of religion. In art, in science, in friendship, in social justice, anywhere a person believes deeply enough to risk themselves. Anywhere someone says, "This may not be certain, but it is worth everything I have." But what makes such belief rational? For James, the answer is pragmatic. If the belief leads to growth, to deeper connection, to moral coherence, then it is justified. Not because it corresponds to some eternal blueprint, but because it works in the texture of life. And here is the pivot. Faith is not a shortcut around thinking. It is thinking carried into commitment. It is the fusion of intellect and will, of reason and risk. To believe, in James's world, is to act as if something were true, not because it is proven, but because it is possible and meaningful and worth testing. And the test is not theoretical. It is lived. The musician tunes. Not because the audience is present, but because the music deserves it. The believer prepares not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the act itself affirms a world worth living in. This is why faith, in James's view, is not reducible to opinion. It is a form of existential artistry, the careful shaping of a life in the direction of a hope. And hope, too, is not naive. It is disciplined. It is sustained belief in the unseen, reinforced by action. So ask yourself, what belief are you tuning your life toward, even when no one is listening? What possibility are you sustaining in the quiet when doubt is loud? Faith, James would say, begins there in the invisible preparation for a truth that does not yet exist, but might. The wind is strong on the mountaintop. A man stands at the edge, jacket flapping, eyes closed. Below him is nothing but mist. He doesn't know what lies on the other side. But he steps forward, not off the edge, but toward the next trail, invisible until taken. This is the shape of belief, according to William James. Movement into mystery, sustained not by proof, but by lived conviction. James called this kind of movement the option of faith. He was clear. We are not always allowed to wait. Life, in its urgency, demands decisions before all evidence is in. And in those moments, the refusal to act is itself a kind of belief. Belief that no possibility is worth the risk. But what if that belief is wrong? He argued that some truths can only be grasped by being lived into. You cannot prove the trustworthiness of a friend without trusting. You cannot verify the depth of a vocation without committing. You cannot know the transformative power of love without choosing it. These are truths that hide behind the veil of action. To reach them, one must first leap. This is why James's philosophy is not a system. It is a call. A call to be present, to choose, to participate in the unfolding of truth. Faith, in this context, is not assent to a proposition. It is allegiance to a possibility. And that allegiance is tested not in theory, but in time. In Pragmatism, James emphasizes that truth happens to an idea. That is, an idea becomes true as it proves itself in the furnace of experience. It must guide, must clarify, must bear fruit. Faith becomes justified not because it corresponds to an eternal form, but because it leads to better action, richer life, deeper coherence. But this only works if we are honest. Faith, for James, is never manipulative. It does not bend truth to our will. It submits our will to a rigorous kind of hope, a hope that remains open to disappointment, but refuses to be paralyzed by it. In this way, faith is not the denial of, doubt. It is doubt's transformation. James did not fear skepticism. He feared stagnation. He believed the soul grows through friction. When doubt and belief coexist in tension, something new can emerge, a kind of tested commitment, resilient because it is not naive. He wrote often about the moral equivalent of war, a form of courage, of devotion, of sacrifice that is not violent, but is no less fierce. For James, faith is that moral equivalent. It is the courage to believe in something you cannot yet see, not because you are certain, but because you are willing to find out, and that willingness is not cheap. It asks for discipline, imagination, and humility. It asks that we remain open to the correction of experience, that we update our beliefs when they fail to deliver meaningful consequences, that we distinguish between what inspires and what imprisons. James, the ultimate test of any belief is this: does it enlarge the world or shrink it? Does it open the future or shut it down? Does it make you more generous, more aware, more capable of acting in the service of what matters? These are not rhetorical questions. They are criteria for spiritual survival. In a world flooded with opinions, ideologies, and demands for certainty, James offers a different standard. Live your belief and let the world answer. And sometimes the answer will surprise you. The step you feared may open a new vista. The commitment you questioned may draw forth new strength. The silence you interpreted as absence may become, through faith, a deeper kind of presence. None of this guarantees comfort. James never promised that faith would solve our problems. He promised that it would make us more alive to them, more willing to meet them with our whole selves. So stand again on that mountaintop, feel the wind, look into the mist, and ask, what possibility is waiting for you to step toward it, not because you are certain, but because you are ready? A child lies in bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the night hums. She's afraid of monsters, of darkness, of being alone. Her parent sits beside her and says softly, "It's okay, I'm here." No proof is offered, no evidence given. But the child believes, not because it's logical, but because something in her heart recognizes that faith, in its purest form, is relational. William James would say, in that moment, belief creates reality. Throughout his writings, James returned to this core insight. Faith is not a trick of the mind, but a function of human life. It is how we navigate the uncertain, how we grow into the unseen, how we make space for truths that do not yet fully exist. And it is not limited to religion. It includes every wager of love, every political commitment, every ethical stand. He saw that modern life tempts us into detachment. We wait. We postpone. We tell ourselves that we'll act when we're sure, but life keeps moving. And James insists, to refuse belief is still a decision with consequences. You may protect yourself from error, but at what cost? At the cost of missing the truths that only belief can reveal. This, for James, is the tragedy of intellectualism unmoored from the moral life. It preserves caution at the expense of becoming, because the self does not grow through knowing alone, it grows through choosing. And every act of belief is a form of self-creation. He was not asking for blind trust. He demanded responsible faith that is tested, revised, embodied. He wanted us to become what he called twice-born souls, individuals who have passed through skepticism into a deeper, hard-earned commitment to what matters. These are not metaphors. They are existential practices. The courage to believe in democracy when it falters. The will to keep loving when relationships strain. The decision to trust your purpose even when clarity dissolves. These are not side effects of belief. They are its fruits. And this is the heart of James's pragmatism. Belief is not a luxury. It is a necessity for moral action. It is how we Move from paralysis to responsibility, from detachment to engagement. You do not need to believe in everything, but you must believe in something. Something you are willing to stake yourself on. Something that, even in doubt, calls you forward. James ends The Will to Believe with a challenge to his readers. He writes that some truths will only become real for us if we allow ourselves to believe in them. They depend, in part, on our willingness to act as if they are true. And so, he asks, will you take that risk? Not recklessly, but responsibly. Will you allow your belief to become the soil where new truths can take root? Will you take the wager? That is the final question. What belief are you willing to test not for certainty, but for consequence? If this journey into William James's thought has opened a new window for you, if it's challenged your idea of faith, or awakened something you thought you had lost leave alike, it's not a click. It's an act of attention. Subscribe. If you want to keep walking this path, exploring the philosophy that dares to live. And share this video with 3 people who, like you, are ready to believe in a different kind of truth, one built not in dogma, but in experience. Because belief, like all things that matter, grows stronger when it is shared.